Welcome to week 12. This is the final lecture of your sports psychology course. And today's topic is inclusion in sport. And hopefully it brings up some really good discussion points for our tutorials later in the week as well, because this is a really important topic that benefits from discussion. And really, even just the fact that this is being included in your course content is a real step forward, because you'll start to think about it. And whether you're looking at becoming a teacher or looking at becoming a sports psychologist yourself, this is something that you will all have to be aware of and consider in your work. So, really important topic for today. And I'm excited to guide you through some of the content that I've got prepared for you today. I would like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respect to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As always, I am based on the Gold Coast. So in this week's lecture, we're covering these 4 broader areas. So starting with understanding barriers to inclusion in sport, and we're particularly going to be focusing on the LGBTQIA+ population and athletes with disabilities. But what I want you to keep in mind as we go through the lecture today, even though we might be specifically referencing those populations, inclusion in sport is relevant to a lot of different populations. We can think about the racial aspects of being inclusive across different racial ethnicities. Definitely important topic in sport. We've got disabilities that covers a broad range, including physical and intellectual. And then we've got the gender and sexual diverse populations, as well as culturally and linguistically diverse populations. And so really what I want you to think about for today is how can you apply some of these key principles that we're going to be covering for really making sport, whether it's a school-based sport or sport into kind of that elite level, making that a safe and welcoming place for everyone. That's really the goal. So even though, as I said, we're specifically going to be covering 2 populations, a lot of this content is really relevant across different populations. So just really keeping that in mind. We're going to get into specific strategies to support athletes and students with disabilities and those identifying as LGBTQIA+, as well as going to be specifically covering inclusion in school sport. So this is hopefully something that whether you're hoping to become a sports psychologist or a teacher, this lecture should be relevant for everyone. Before we get further into the content for today, this is a brief video that I wanted to start with to reiterate what I just mentioned and to bring to the forefront of our minds the importance of inclusion in sport. This video is from Sport for All, which is a national award-winning program driving positive change in sport inclusion for people with disabilities. Their purpose is to give people with disability the opportunity to have choice and control on where and how they participate in club and school sports, whether it's through playing, coaching, administration, or any other role.
My name's Johnny and I'm the Sport for All State Manager for Victoria, Tasmania and South Australia. Across Australia, sport brings people together. It's where communities connect, young people grow and inclusion starts to feel real. Because when everyone can take part, sport doesn't just build skills, it builds belonging. Across Australia, over 5.5 million people, that's over 21%, live with a disability. Sport for All is working with schools, clubs and councils to make sport more inclusive for people with disability. Together we focus on understanding each community, learning from lived experience and creating environments where everyone can take part. And this is how inclusion becomes part of everyday sport.
Okay, so we're now going to start off with looking at the barriers to sport participation in diverse gender and sexual identities. It's really important to understand the climate that is sometimes naturally there without maybe you even being aware of it. So this might be something that you haven't even necessarily thought of. Now, within the research, sport has long been described as a homo-negative climate, and it's often experienced as disinviting for LGBTQIA+ athletes and coaches. So this is something that for the individuals who are a part of the LGBTQIA+ community, it's something that they may have naturally picked up on. But if you're not a part of that community, it's something that you may not have even noticed. Some of the, the cultural and environmental kind of things that just happen automatically, that can sometimes make certain people feel unwelcome or that they don't quite belong. So I'm just going to define some of the important terms here that are really highlighted in the literature. And one of those terms is a heteronormative climate. So the idea of this is this ever-presenting cultural bias favouring heterosexuality and omitting other forms of sexuality. So the idea is that it is really privileging a certain type of sexual identity, and it's rarely questioned. So I guess, an example of this is maybe for an athlete in a team, they might, if they're male, for example, they might always be asked by teammates or their coach, do you have a girlfriend? Or are you looking to find a girlfriend? And, this is absolutely not necessarily ill-intentioned, but the idea is that it's assuming that that person is heterosexual. And that idea of it's not even necessarily even considered or questioned that they may actually have a male partner, for example. So this can inadvertently lead to rendering sexual orientations other than heterosexuality as invisible and unnoticed. So it's just this idea that we should be aware of in sport. And look, we could probably extend that beyond sport as well, that there is a cultural bias that favours heterosexuality and sometimes forgets that there are a lot of people who don't fit into that specific heterosexual domain. Being aware of this is one of the first steps because it might actually create some awareness around even language you use or how you might phrase a certain question. And I think it's really important here to just note that it doesn't mean that the intentions of people who have fallen into that heteronormative climate, it doesn't mean that they've got ill intentions. But it still can create a climate where those who are not heterosexual can feel uninvited or invisible, right? So it's really important to be aware of. Similarly, this term cisnormativity. It's the assumption that a person's assigned birth gender corresponds with a mutually exclusive set of masculine or feminine attributes, aptitudes, abilities, and desires. So similar to creating a heteronormative climate, cisnormativity is assuming that someone's assigned birth, so if they're male, that it automatically is going to correspond with masculine traits and not necessarily having the awareness or understanding that is just not the case for some people. And so that can act in a way of having a similar impact on people feeling disinvited and invisible in that. And I think as we're going to be touching on a little bit later as well, it can lead to people within the LGBTQIA+ community to actually start to maybe play a role of hiding their sexual or gender identities too, because that feels safer to do so. And, those are the ones who actually end up participating in sport. And within the research, it's highlighted that because of some of these factors, a lot of people within this community just don't engage because they either don't feel safe and they don't feel welcomed into some of these sporting clubs or communities. So the idea behind this term, inclusive excellence, it's a coined term to actually look at moving forward in this area, to actually create striving for excellence by embracing multicultural and diverse individuals. So the idea of excellence is really part and parcel of the sport. Sporting excellence is something that we would hear a lot in terms of the physical pursuit of a sport. And so the American College and University Association, really came up with this term to help to promote the idea of diversity and inclusion and becoming excellent at doing this. And so the idea is that diversity is a systematic process that engages differences and transforms learning environments with a primary aim towards reflecting, supporting, and sustaining goals of inclusion and excellence. So, in other words, excellence is achieved by embracing multicultural and diverse individuals. And so the idea behind it is really to challenge hetero and cis normative environments by really promoting this idea of inclusion excellence. And as I mentioned, it really aligns with the idea and goals of sport to be excellent. And why not be excellent at inclusivity? And really helping that team make sure that each person feels welcome and included and that they're all a part of the team. So yeah, some really important terminology here that we're highlighting in this slide. Now, within a particular study by Storr et al. In 2022, it really outlined some of the really specific key barriers for sport participation within the LGBTQIA+ population. The crux of this article, and I will put this one up for all of you to have a read of, the crux of it is that, as probably a lot of us are aware, there's a lot of initiatives that have come out to try to highlight the importance of being inclusive, and it's evident in this AFL image of being allies and really highlighting it. And this article really makes a point of saying that, yes, those efforts are being made, but we can't become complacent and just assume that now sport is an inclusive environment, you know? And so the authors within this article, based on reviewing research and asking athletes about this across 5 different studies, the authors actually argued that inclusion often remains a surface level or non-performative commitment. So it's this idea that clubs and teams can highlight that they're inclusive, but it's not always effectively enacted in practice. And so the illusion of inclusion can actually mask the persistent inequality that is going on. And the idea can be this thought that, it's not even an issue anymore. People don't even care if someone's in the LGBTQIA+ population. And this kind of attitude can actually be quite harmful, to just assume that it's all sorted now because based on the research, it actually isn't. And it's something that we still really need to be aware of and make sure that we're not just being performative and remaining on a surface level, saying that we're all allies and then still engaging in some of those things, like we just talked about, that heteronormative climate that is continuing to make this population feel invisible. So, some of the key areas where it was evident across the research that there are ongoing barriers for sport participation in this group, we start off with pervasive discrimination and harassment. So this is really evident by explicit abuse, such as slurs. Now, I'm not going to give you specifics around what that would be, but I think you can probably imagine. And these are still commonly reported by athletes, fans, and volunteers, according to the research. And this discrimination still occurs across playing fields, spectator stands, and within the administrative environments. So when we're thinking about sport as well, remember that goes beyond just the athletes. It can also occur for a coach who may be in the LGBTQIA+ population or support staff. And the evidence based on the research is that even a one-off incident can have a lasting psychological impact, especially for young people engaging in sports. So the idea that a slur from another team member or from an opponent, that could be enough for a young athlete to not come back to that sport. So a really significant impact that it can have. Now, this is a direct quote from a young gay male aerial sport participant who said that a comment that was thrown at him was that people are like, look, Look at that poofter. They shouldn't be doing that if they are a real man. So even getting particular discrimination for engaging in aerial sport and being a male. So, quite significant stuff that is still going on today and is really important for us to be aware of. Then we have this idea of an unsafe sporting space. So many LGBTQIA+ individuals, based on the research, do not perceive sporting environments as safe. And there's a particular reference in the research around change rooms and bathrooms, and this was especially highlighted for trans individuals. And so it's really important to kind of be aware of the actual environment that can actually create a sense of unsafety. And this is, I guess, for more of that elite sport, but large stadiums or alcohol-fueled fan zones were really highlighted as particular environments that create that feeling of being unsafe for those in the LGBTQIA+ population. So, participants within the research reported a constant fear of violence or verbal abuse, deterring attendance and participation. And a particular trans woman that was a part of this research indicated the fear of violence is constant. So that might be something that others around may not even be aware of. But there are individuals who are literally feeling fear of being verbally or physically abused constantly. So that's a real barrier to participation, as you can imagine. That's going to make it quite difficult for someone to want to continue to engage in sport. And the other key points are exclusionary culture and stereotyping. So really, it's this idea that in sport, there can be this real culture that in order to feel like you fit in or belong, you feel like you have to conform to certain gender stereotypes. And so I think the obvious one here would be, in some of those really male, combat sports such as rugby, AFL, which has really been highlighted a lot across the research. A lot of the participants mention that they feel they have to conform to certain gender stereotypes of that masculinity and really show this in order to feel like they actually belong and to actually be themselves. If it didn't really necessarily align with that gender stereotype, it could feel quite unsafe or genuinely just feel like, well, if I was to engage in that, I wouldn't belong. So there's some really significant barriers. And then the final one that I've really referenced already is this idea of invisibility. So many athletes and even professionals within the sport felt pressured to hide their identity, especially around maybe getting promoted in sport and around senior management. So this idea of, just trying to fit in and hiding their gender or sexual orientations, because there's that fear that if they revealed this, that it would impact how they were treated by others and potentially promotion in sport. So now we're just going to jump into the barriers to sport participation for those with disabilities. And there are quite a few barriers that are quite unique to this specific population that might be quite different for the barriers that may be experienced from those in the LGBTQIA+ population. And so one of the key aspects that many people may not necessarily even think about is the influence of a traumatic event. So based on the research, as much as 85% of those with a physical or sensory disability have an acquired disability as the result of a traumatic event. So as you can expect, such adverse life events, particularly the ones that have occurred quite recently, they're often linked to identity, personality, and emotional changes, which can really be quite significant. And so when we're thinking about some of the psychological and emotional changes that may be seen or viewed within people who have disabilities, it can include heightened anger, hostility, frustration, and even reduced efforts to cooperate and de-escalate conflicts. And it's really important to understand that these characteristics are similar to those of individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. And many of those with disabilities who have experienced a traumatic event that has led to their disability could be diagnosed potentially with PTSD or have subclinical symptoms, which means that they have some of the symptoms with PTSD, but they don't have all of the symptoms to qualify for that diagnosis. But nevertheless, it's really important to understand the context of trauma for those with disabilities in sport, because it really does explain some of the personality and emotional changes that can be displayed. And so having that understanding is super important when it comes to working with these individuals, because you're not just working with that physical disability, you're also working with a person who potentially has experienced a traumatic event. And that event may not have happened that long ago. So really important to be aware of. Also, this of course can be a barrier to sport participation because, some of these emotional outbursts and some of those psychological changes, they can certainly make it difficult for individuals with disabilities to engage in sport, and there can be potential conflicts that arise with people. And so, really important to be aware of this factor. An important role model and advocate in this space, after experiencing her own traumatic brain injury from a cycling accident, is the Australian Paralympic Alexa Leary. Some of you may know of her, and I'm going to be showing a brief video on her story on the next slide. She's actually a family friend of mine, and watching her journey has been nothing short of inspiring. And her experience is a prime example of what we're referring to here. Now, the other factor that is highlighted in the literature is the idea of dignity. And so threats to dignity of people with disabilities that occur when an individual is made to feel that they are being stereotyped, pitied, viewed negatively, or subjected to behaviours that are offensive. So an example of this is people staring at them, which can of course induce a lot of embarrassment and cause someone to not want to be in that position to have people staring at them. And so some of the stereotypes that we can think about, or how people with disabilities can be perceived. There can be this idea of incompetence, that just because someone has a disability, they're somehow not competent or not incredible athletes and really able to do a lot of things. People can really focus on the things that they're limited by, and this point here that there can also be a lack of respect relative to able-bodied athletes. So this idea that if someone has a disability, that they're somehow not as athletic as an able-bodied athlete, and it's just simply not true. These athletes are incredible at their sports, and I can only imagine that it would be really frustrating to not feel respected for what you do. And that, of course, can lead to individuals disengaging from sport. Now, just highlighting that within the banner of dignity and privacy, so it's really important, particularly for us, being potential sports psychologists or teachers, it's really important to understand that those with a disability do reserve privacy, and remember, they're not always going to be comfortable sharing about their disability in front of other people. So some really important aspects around allowing athletes to have conversations that other people do not overhear. Making sure that you don't assume that the athletes are comfortable sharing around others. And really being mindful of giving them the respect of privacy before asking them a lot of questions about their disability. There may be some factors that, in order to support them, it may be important for you to know, but really don't assume that because they've had a disability for a while, or you might think they seem quite comfortable with their disability, but don't just assume. Give them that space to be able to talk one-on-one without other people overhearing. Which at this point is being brought up because it does happen a lot where people ask in front of other people about their disabilities, and that can cause embarrassment and shame. And it really can reduce that sharing of dignity. And this final point, stresses. which it really does encompass so many different aspects that are quite unique to those with disabilities. So we can start off here with that point around environmental barriers. So even just something as simple as having access to getting to training, that can become a stressor. Because if there is no wheelchair ramp, or if the usual training centre does have one, but they're travelling for sport and then this new training centre does not, that can be quite stressful because it will require some workarounds. So how do I actually get into this building? How do I actually engage in my training? And that obviously can cause a lot of stress. The para sport classification system. So this is a system where the level of impairment is evaluated to determine the grouping in which athletes will compete. And so even though the aim is to ensure that athletes compete against athletes with a similar level of impairment, there can be a perception that competition outcomes are predictable. So athletes with less severe impairments within a class are basically expected to win. And so this particular topic was exemplified by classifications in judo, where partially sighted athletes competed against blind athletes. Yet the partially sighted athletes have a significantly higher competition placing, suggesting that they are at advantage by the classification method. So that's basically saying that even though the intention of the sport classification system is to make competition as even as possible, it can actually cause a lot of stress for athletes because there unfortunately can be this inherent bias where within the category that those with the least, impactful disability can really be seen as being quite advantaged. And for some athletes, it can make them feel like they're fighting an uphill battle. And so, it's just really important to understand this. And if you're working in this space, trying to get an understanding of the sports classification system and the unique stresses that are involved in this. The other one which can come up quite a bit is the stress about the perception of others. So there can be this perception that some athletes may face a more severe impairment during evaluations, causing athletes to compete against people who actually have less severe disabilities. So those who have legitimate disabilities and who are correctly classified can feel stress or can actually be out with the accused of cheating just because they do really well. And that behind the scenes may be linked to so much dedication and time in their sport to really overcome their barriers as best that they can. And yet that can be a perception. Well, if you've done really well, you've been faking your impairment, which of course would be incredibly frustrating because, you've actually done really well because of your hard work and people perceive that you're actually faking it. And this final point, support personnel. So in certain para sports, they have to rely on support personnel for them to be able to compete. And so the performance of the support personnel can actually directly impact the athlete's performance. So, for example, in swimming, which is in the image here, you can see that little ball and rod. That is the task of a tapper, which is basically to warn swimmers with a visual impairment when they are near the pool's wall. And so the tapper taps the swimmer on the back and head with that pole, notifying them of the need to turn. But if the tapper fails to correctly gauge the swimming speed and distance from the wall, or is distracted, the swimmer can actually collide with the wall at top speed or execute to tend awkwardly, losing time. So the athlete's actually having to rely on another person, which of course is going to cause stress because, that other person may not be as dedicated or they may be really trying their best, but they can also make mistakes and that influences the swimmer. So really just being aware of some of these specific unique barriers to those with disabilities can go a long way. And I wonder whether some of those ones that I've mentioned today, maybe they were ones you hadn't necessarily thought of. But hopefully now that you're aware of it, that can help you with actually working with this group in the future. So I'm now going to play a snippet of an interview from Channel 9 News with Alexa Leary to show a bit of her incredible story and to bring to life some of the content we've just discussed around the influence of a traumatic event. They mostly talk about the amazing achievements she's been able to reach and her book launch. However, I know that she's had a really challenging journey in regards to her personality changes, physical abilities, as well as psychological and emotional changes.
Well, she is one of Australia's golden girls with a story of survival that continues to inspire us all. From learning to walk and talk again after a devastating cycling crash in 2021 to taking home gold at the 2024 Paris Paralympics.
Hey.
Alexa Leary is one hell of a fighter.
And now she's taking on a new challenge, opening up about the reality of living with a traumatic brain injury in her new memoir, Sink or Swim, Defying the Odds. And the superstar herself joins us live in the studio. Big round of applause for Alexa Leary.
Alexa. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
So tell us all about it.
Okay, so it's the truth, of my whole accident, and I love the fact that it's going to bring out awareness of a traumatic brain injury, something that I will live with for the rest of my life. But I'm just so happy that it's on the paper, and I'm just so excited.
It must have been, or was it difficult to recollect everything that you'd been through and put those words down on a piece of paper?
Yeah, it really was. It was really hard for me because a lot of things that I didn't want in the book, but it was better to share. It was good to share and help a lot of people. So it was a good thing.
Going through that recovery and writing about it, that is hard. What was that process like?
Yeah, recovery. So in recovery, I'll be in recovery for the rest of my life. But that's okay. I embrace it that I'm even alive. But yeah, recovery every day is hard and everything is hard, trying to get my brain to work with me and my body because I've got physical damage as well. It's a lot harder than anyone can expect.
The darkest days for you, Alexa, how bad did it get sometimes?
Oh, it got so bad, and even my mental state, it was just, I didn't know what I wanted with my life. I was so confused, and that's why I'm just so lucky that I'm here, though. I'm very lucky.
Did you ever think you'd swim again?
100%. I knew that deep down in my brain was I need a goal in my life. I've had the accident. I need to strive and thrive for something new for myself, to make myself proud.
Was the Paralympics the goal for you?
Yes, it sure was. Even a quantum healer that I had in the accident, she read to my parents that Lex is going to go to the Paralympics and bring home 3 medals.
Wow.
And it happened.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So this slide is here to provide you with some of the resources that you can access to actually upskill yourself, particularly in working with certain population groups. Now, obviously today's lecture is an overview and it's giving you some practical tips that I hope you'll be able to utilise, but it's really important that when you're working with population groups that maybe you're not as familiar with, that you actually go and educate yourself, to be aware of some of the unique barriers that they may face and how to actually work with this population in the most ethical and effective way. So the Australian Psychological Society have guidelines for psychologists working with diverse populations. So there is a specific ethical guideline for psychological practice with lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients. And there's also a specific guideline on working with sex and or gender diverse clients. And finally, there's an ethical guideline for psychological practice with clients with an intellectual disability. They don't have a specific guideline for working with those with physical disabilities, but they do have a lot of resources in that space as well, just not a specific guideline. If you want to have a read through any of these, you can find them in your additional learning materials, and we'll go through a summary of the key principles that come out of these guidelines in the next slide, just to help familiarise you with some of the things to consider. And this last one, the Sport Australian Guidelines, there is a specific one for the inclusion of transgender and gender diverse people in sport, and Clearinghouse, which is the Sport Australia site. This has a lot of resources for those with disabilities and LGBTQIA+ individuals. So even just Googling clearinghouse and typing in that particular diverse population group, that can be a really good way to gain some resources when working with certain populations. So just keep this in mind. So across each of the ethical guidelines, there are some real core principles that come out. So even if you maybe are working with someone and it's one of your first sessions or first classes, and you don't necessarily have a lot of information about a particular population group. And I think this is an important one for me to mention because as practitioners or teachers, we can't be expected to know everything about every single diverse population group that we're going to come by. You know, we often will be educated by our clients or students as well. You know, going ahead and doing our own research to upskill though is still really important. And so if you kind of present yourself with some of these key principles around ethical and appropriate behaviour, even if you don't know the intricate details or nature of certain population groups, you can still be helpful and respectful. And really one of the key ones is doing no harm. So there can often be a lot of fear for people. Oh, I don't know if I would know the right thing to say, or I'm worried about saying the wrong thing. Generally, if you're coming out of a position of, for example, the first point of respect, you're asking for informed consent, you're using as much inclusive language and communicating with cultural sensitivity and affirmation, you're setting appropriate boundaries, and you're really intentionally committed to not being discriminatory, that's going to take you a really long way. And so a lot of these core principles are going to be relevant across so many different diverse population groups. So really use these as your foundation for how to treat people, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to be treated with respect, regardless of the diverse population group that they come from. So this first point, respect and justice, it's such a foundational aspect for us as humans, and thus it's really highlighted by the Australian Psychological Society. So it's this idea of promoting autonomy, dignity, and equity in all psychological practices. And so it's being inclusive of yourself and providing support and dignity to all individuals, regardless of race, gender, or disability. And so, having that intent to avoid being discriminatory based on any of those factors. And so one of the key aspects that is really relevant here, in order to respect the rights and dignity of those people, is advocating for them when they're being unfairly treated or experiencing systematic disadvantages. You can actually be their voice sometimes when they may not feel capable of doing that. So showing that you actually genuinely care and showing respect, it really does go a long way. And that relates to one of the core principles of the APS, Code of Ethics, which is that respect for the rights and dignity of people and peoples. So whoever you're working with, that's a core ethical principle there. Informed consent. So ensure that consent is clear, voluntary, and well understood using plain language. So for those with disabilities, making sure that you're actually tailoring your communication to the level of understanding, and as much as possible, getting informed consent from that individual. Don't just assume that because someone, for example, has had a brain injury, don't just assume that they're automatically not going to be able to provide consent. That's not always the case. People with brain injuries can be very capable and, of course, deserve the opportunity to provide their own informed consent as well. And so, that's a really fundamental one because sometimes some of our assumptions can lead us to assume things. So remember to continuously check that consent from that person and that it's maintained and updated and updates your clients on their rights and options. So just like everyone else, just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that they don't still have the right to informed consent. And that goes even towards what you share with other people. So it could be a potential trap where if someone has a physical disability and have shared about that disability with you as a psychologist, don't just assume that you can then share that with another support team member, because that individual athlete has given that information to you, and you specifically need to get consent from the athlete if you were to share any information about them with someone else. I say this because there are certain things that can seem really obvious. You know, if someone talked to a psychologist about their trauma, it's really obvious that you're not going to share that with someone else. But when it comes to physical disabilities, that can sometimes be overlooked. And there can be assumptions that the athlete is happy for you to share whatever, but you actually need to get informed consent for that. Now, this point of competence. So, psychologists must only practice within the boundaries of their education and training. And so when a psychologist is working with new populations, it's really important to get supervision and further training. So this really helps to avoid assumptions and allows a psychologist to be as educated as possible. So it doesn't mean you can't work with that group. It's really important to just access relevant resources and get supervision when you maybe are a bit stuck and don't know exactly where to go with a certain population group. As I've mentioned, confidentiality and privacy is just as relevant here as every other group. Communication and inclusion, so using accessible language, visual aids, or assistive technology when needed. So it's referring to certain disabilities where you might need to adapt how you communicate to that individual. So really basic things like respecting the preferred names, pronouns, and how the client in front of you identifies. And really validating lived experiences of marginalization or trauma. Maintaining professional boundaries. I think that's relevant across all clients, but just recognizing that abilities and understanding can change with support, trust, and experience. So it's really important to understand that when you're providing support to someone with a disability, know your role and don't overstep your role. And make sure that you're still creating healthy boundaries. So that could mean stepping back and giving that client autonomy when needed as well. And just this final point, commitment to anti-discrimination. So this idea that once we understand the systemic barriers, and we've really talked about quite a few of them today, that are faced by these populations in education, sport, and in the community, psychologists have an ethical responsibility to advocate for clients and participate in inclusive practices at all levels, from individual care to public policy. And so really having this stance of committing to anti-discrimination and being an advocate, because once you are aware of the discrimination that occurs, ethically, psychologists do have a responsibility to help move this in a positive direction. Okay, so some of the practical strategies to move towards increased inclusion. We've looked at quite a few of the barriers, but that's not to get us to feel like we're hopeless. No, there's actually a lot of things that we can do to move towards increased inclusion. So this term inclusive excellence that we highlighted at the start of the lecture, it's grounded in the social identity framework. So from earlier lectures, that should really be something that you all understand by now. And as we know, a major premise of the social identity perspective is really when we adopt new social identities, we then learn the expected values and behaviours of that group. And this will become consistent with the team norms. So it's really important to understand that once we develop the team's social norms, that then becomes a part of the identity, and it actually encourages members to be really productive and stimulating all team members towards the team goals. So really creating an identity with a team of inclusion, because this actually drives and motivates people to actually do that. So a social identity framework encourages a sense of belonging, and if the values and behaviours of inclusion are adopted early on within the team, it really leads to specific behaviours that are led by those values. And so creating this as a part of the identity of a team, that we're a team that's inclusive, because of the nature of humans wanting to belong, it will be a really strong motivator for people to actually align with that. Whereas if there's an identity of a team as being, for example, hypermasculine, and that everyone should display those behaviours, then that is going to be what people are going to want to align to. And that's something where those, as we mentioned earlier, who don't align with that stereotypical masculine role can start to actually feel invisible and just display what they think the identity of the team is. So actually shaping the identity of the team early on, and the role of sports psychologists in doing that is really important, because it has a strong link to what behaviours are actually going to be lived out day to day once the identity is formed. And so when we're thinking about some of the practical strategies to move towards increased inclusion for LGBTQIA+ people, there's lots of really practical things you can do. And so hopefully quite a few of these have already been evident as I've been talking through some of the barriers, but this is just to really make it clear around what can actually be done. So starting with establishing an identity of being a team member that embraces all athletes. So the identity of a team member is what actually brings everyone together and puts everyone on the same page, regardless of the differences that might be present elsewhere. So this identity of a team member and establishing that is really important. Recognizing diversity as a team strength. So it's not just about pretending everyone's exactly the same and just ignoring those that are actually recognizing diversity, but seeing that as actually a strength. Using inclusive language and avoiding assumptions. So some of that heteronormative culture that we've talked about. Encouraging open conversations about individual differences can lead us to model productive, inclusive behaviours and challenge unproductive team norms and providing education. So this last point is around don't just become complicit and unproductive in team culture. If the identity or culture of a team is in a direction like a really heteronormative, hypermasculine, that really excludes others, that actually needs to be challenged. And the athletes need to be educated around how that can be making some people feel not included and how that can actually impact the cohesion of the team as a whole. So this is where, whether you're a teacher or a sports psychologist, if you see some of this going on, it's really important to actually not just let it happen and sit by. We have a responsibility to challenge some of these climates that can be developed in teams. Similar to the LGBTQIA+ population, a lot of these strategies tap into the barriers that we've mentioned earlier. So we've got here awareness of post-traumatic changes, promoting dignity. This one, being aware of an array of goals specific to disability. So it's this idea of the goal not always being just about performance. And within the literature, it talks about sometimes the goal for those with disabilities. For example, a particular athlete in para sport really highlighted one of their goals was around perception of others. So to be seen as an athlete and to be seen as capable, that was their goal. So, making sure to not just assume that all of the goals are going to be the same. There can be quite specific goals for those with a disability. Being aware of and providing support with stress management, specific to understanding the stresses in sport. So being aware when classification comes up, that is likely to be a very high stress time, and making sure that efforts are being made to really upskill the athletes in how they can actually manage stress during these periods. Because as we've discussed earlier, that classification aspect can be a real stressor. Enhancing efforts to increase social cohesion. So really highlighting that for those with disabilities, any opportunity to provide inclusion and mixed settings with able-bodied athletes really promotes the importance of how skilled the para athletes are and how they should be treated with the same respect as able-bodied athletes by giving them opportunities to mingle together. That can really move towards increased inclusion. And just by being prepared to assist athletes in identifying a range of resources. So really here, just recognizing that for those with disabilities, as a sports psychologist or as a teacher, you may have to step in and provide support in areas you wouldn't usually. So making sure that there is adequate transport to and from a place, you may have to really help the athlete identify how they can get there. And particularly when we're thinking about Paralympics and parasport, you may even need to step into the role of a support personnel because they need all hands on deck to really support those with disabilities because oftentimes they are understaffed. And so being flexible and not just going, oh, well, I'm the sports psychologist, so I'm not going to help with that. That's just not going to be feasible when working in a space with those with a disability. So, yeah, more important things to be aware of there. And finally, this slide just really highlights some of the specifics around inclusion in school-based sport. So this is actually based on a study by Gentile et al. In 2023. And so what this research really looked at was promoting physical activity and inclusion for all students, regardless of ability. And some of the key strategies that were highlighted in school-based sport is finding ways to adapt rules and equipment to make sure that everyone is included, adapting roles to encourage participation, and using games that encourage cooperation, not just competitions. So not just having every single school-based sport be about someone winning, actually incorporating games and physical activity that is about teamwork and working together for a common goal, not just always pinning everyone against each other. And by doing this actually improves peer relationships, confidence, inclusion, and engagement in physical activity. So I haven't gone too much into the specifics here about how you can specifically adapt games in school-based sport. That's something that's probably a little bit out of the scope of this lecture. But what was really evident in this study is that there is a really strong link to actually those teachers who had an understanding and some kind of level of confidence in adapting sports. And there was a link between that and actually being more inclusive. So it's really important to familiarise yourself as a teacher in possible ways that you could be inclusive. Because based on the research, it is a lot more likely that you will actually engage in those behaviours to include other students. And this research highlighted a few facts that were really interesting. So cases with fewer special needs students tended to report a more positive attitude towards inclusion. So it's just highlighting here that particularly for teachers with some of those younger years where a lot of things have to be adapted, that actually led to more negative view of being inclusive. And so it was thought to be linked to high levels of stress that actually led those teachers to be less positive towards inclusion. Another factor was around familiarity and self-efficacy. So for teachers who are familiar with and had self-efficacy in their ability to adapt games and sports for people with disabilities or for diverse populations, there was a moderate association with the use of inclusive strategies. So the idea is that teachers who are more familiar with ways to adapt were more likely to actually adapt things for their students. So, being familiar and confident with the use of inclusive strategies, it positively influences whether teachers will actually do that. And so really what I think is really great is that one of the recommendations of this research was that teachers should be educated around inclusion and its importance, because this is actually linked to more positive attitudes, and it's also linked to teachers being more proactive in going out to actually find ways to adapt games and sports. So look, we've actually done that today. And so if you're studying to become a teacher based on the recommendations from the research, I really encourage you to actually go further and familiarise yourself with ways that you could adapt games to be inclusive for those with different disabilities. Because when you're in that context and you're teaching, you're a lot more likely to actually be one of those teachers that is proactive and actually is inclusive, rather than becoming complacent and inadvertently leaving students out because they, for whatever reason, they don't feel comfortable or can't practically be involved in the way that school sport is being administered. So that's, I guess, one of those practical things to go out and educate yourself for this particular area. And I guess this is specifically relevant for those who wish to become teachers down the track. We're now going to finish off the lecture with this video from Pushing Barriers to see the work they have been doing and to show you that organisations exist out there to assist sporting clubs and schools with ensuring inclusivity in sport exists. So if you're a coach, parent or future teacher, finding out what organisations are local to your area and finding ways to work with them or getting them involved in your team, school or sporting club can really make a big difference as well.
It's so important for sporting clubs to celebrate diversity and ensure that they're inclusive of people with diverse backgrounds, even if they themselves feel like they're lacking confidence or lacking the resources to do that. Reaching out to organisations like Pushing Barriers, who can have involvement in supporting the engagement of culturally and linguistically diverse communities.
We've started with a multicultural liaison officer as a new role this year, and so that person has been, I guess, bringing us information on what we can do as a club to be even better than what we currently are in terms of diversity and acceptance.
It can be quite confronting for a family member to go to a club when they don't have an understanding how things work, they don't have English, so that's where we come in. So I think it's really important for clubs to partner with a community organisation like ours, where you can work together, where we take on the role of talking to families, communicating with families.
Making decisions and involving our members is so important. You know, I think it's very naive to think you know it all, and I think it's so important to involve not only your members, but the local community, you know, where we have a chat, you know, things as simple as talking to neighbours. It's so important to involve as many stakeholders as you can and build those relationships along the way.
We find that because we're very approachable, that parents can often come and talk to us. We sort of find that really helps overcome a lot of those barriers where parents don't know how to do the registration initially, or where to pick up their uniforms, or if something's gone wrong. So because there's generally a couple of the committee around during most of the times, we find that really helps to engage those parents who might often just sit in their car or do something along those lines. We do have people of diverse backgrounds on our leadership board, which is great, and we've actually taken on board some ideas. Just one of them, for example, has been in our canteen, where we've now made it more halal friendly, which has been a fabulous initiative, and it was a very small change that we had to make, but such a big one for half of our population that are halal.
It's about moving almost beyond cultural awareness to something called cultural responsiveness, which is thinking really carefully about how you respond to diversity in a really respectful way. So some of my greatest learnings have been from the players themselves. I think in the context of those relationships, we've created a space where players feel confident sharing what's important to them and their identity. So it's having that genuine curiosity and openness to learning. You know, it's not about being right or wrong, it's about understanding and respecting and valuing that difference.
They've come out of very, very tough backgrounds, and to see what they've had to face on a daily basis, and some of them are the happiest participants we have in our club. We can take a lot from that, to just know that they might have been through hell and back, and yet they're still here and they're happy and they just want to play sport, and to see the joy on their faces is something that I guess makes me proud that we can provide that opportunity for them.
Every day's Harmony Week. You come here and you just have so many different cultures, and that's celebrated by just, you know, letting them be themselves, and I think that there's power in that.
So thank you so much for your participation throughout this lecture and this course this trimester. It's been an absolute pleasure doing these lectures for you, and I really hope you've gotten something valuable that you can use in your future careers. With that in mind, I'd like to wish you luck with the rest of your studies, and I'll see those of you who are in my tutes this week, but that is all from me, so thank you once again.